All right, so let's dive into something that I think is probably on all of our minds these days. Texting.
Yeah,
We use it for everything, right?
pretty much.
From quick hellos to, well, sharing work info, we just fire off these messages, assuming they vanish into the ether, securely reaching the other person's phone.
Right.
But what if I told you that that sense of privacy might be, well, an illusion,
Hmm.
especially when you're texting between iPhones and Androids?
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, and that's the unsettling reality the FBI is actually warning us about. And it's got a lot to do with this recent hack called Salt Typhoon.
Salt Typhoon, huh?
Huh. So in this deep dive, we're going to unpack why exactly those cross-platform texts are so vulnerable, what went down with this whole Salt Typhoon situation, and most importantly, what practical steps you can take to protect your conversations.
It is interesting. We all think of our phones as these fortresses of personal data, locked down with passcodes and all that.
Right.
But when it comes to texting, the security model is surprisingly outdated. Almost like we're back in the Wild West days of the internet.
Okay, I'm intrigued. So break this down for me. What's going on behind the scenes that makes these cross-platform texts so vulnerable?
The key here is encryption, or rather, the lack of it.
Okay.
See, when you text someone using the same operating system as you, iPhone to iPhone, Android to Android, those messages are usually encrypted.
Okay.
It's like sending a sealed letter that only the recipient can open. But the moment you send a text between an iPhone and an Android, it's like that letter's being sent in a clear envelope, potentially exposed for anyone with the right tools to read.
So if I, with my iPhone, text my friend who's rocking an Android,
Yeah.
anyone snooping around could potentially see our conversation.
Potentially, yeah.
Seriously.
It's not just a possibility, it's a reality. And we're not just talking about some random person peeking. This is where the Salt Typhoon hack comes into play. Chinese hackers successfully infiltrated major U.S. telecom companies.
Oh.
And the scope of their access is pretty chilling.
I've heard whispers about this Salt Typhoon thing. What exactly did they get their hands on?
Think of it as a triple whammy.
Okay.
They got into call records, already concerning, but then it gets worse.
Yeah.
They were able to tap into live calls of specific individuals they were targeting.
Oh, wow.
But the most alarming part, they compromised systems that law enforcement agencies use for tracking orders, things you'd assume would be heavily protected.
So this isn't just about snooping on private conversations anymore. This sounds like a major security breach with far-reaching implications.
Exactly. If we zoom out and look at the bigger picture, this wasn't just about grabbing data. It was a strategic move to potentially interfere with investigations, mess with national security, and gain a significant advantage. This is espionage on a whole other level.
Wow, that's unsettling. So what are we supposed to do? Is there anything we can actually do to protect ourselves?
Well, the FBI and CISA have some advice, but honestly, it feels like a bit of a Band-Aid on a bullet wound. Their main recommendation is to use encrypted messaging apps whenever possible. Think Signal, WhatsApp, Telegram, those kinds of platforms.
Yeah.
They offer end-to-end encryption, meaning even the app companies themselves can't see your messages. It's like sending that letter through a super secure courier service.
That makes sense. But let's be real for a second. How many people are going to switch their entire messaging habits because of this? I mean, texting is just so ingrained in how we communicate.
You raise a valid point. Convenience often wins, even when it comes to security. The FBI also threw out some additional tips, things like making sure your phone has automatic updates enabled, choosing a phone with robust encryption built in, and enabling multi-factor authentication, like an extra layer of security for your accounts. But all of this is just damage control.
It does feel like we're trying to fix a systemic problem with individual solutions. It makes me wonder, why hasn't this lack of a universal secure standard for texting been addressed before? What are the roadblocks?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And it's one we need to start asking more loudly.
Well, you've definitely given us a lot to think about. This is way more than just some tech issue. It's about our privacy, our security, and how we communicate in this increasingly digital world.
Absolutely. This affects everyone. And the more you understand about it, the better equipped you are to protect yourself.
Okay, so we've established that cross-platform texting is vulnerable, and this Salt Typhoon situation just threw gasoline on the fire. But where do we go from here? What are the implications of all this for the average person who relies on texting?
That's where things get really interesting. Think about it. Everything from your weekend plans to sensitive work discussions, maybe even financial or medical information, it all gets thrown around in text messages. Now imagine that information hanging out in the open, visible to who knows who. It's a sobering thought, isn't it?
It is. And it makes you wonder, why haven't we heard more about this before? Why is it that in 2024, something as basic as texting between different phones isn't secure by default?
You'd think in this age of data breaches and cybersecurity awareness, this would have been addressed ages ago, right? But there are a few historical reasons why cross-platform encryption hasn't quite taken off.
All right, lay it on me. What are we talking about here?
Well, for starters, the two major players, Apple and Google, with their respective iMessage and Android messaging systems, haven't exactly been eager to play nice and create a universally compatible encrypted standard.
Yeah, I guess it makes sense from a competitive standpoint. They want to keep their users locked into their ecosystems, but at what cost, right?
Exactly. And then there's the technical side of things. Creating a system that seamlessly encrypts messages across different operating systems, with different protocols and backends. It's no easy feat. It requires a level of collaboration and standardization that, frankly, we haven't seen yet.
So it's a combination of competing interests and technical hurdles. It sounds like a recipe for, well, exactly what we're seeing now, a major vulnerability that's ripe for exploitation.
Unfortunately, yes. And the Salt Typhoon hack is a stark reminder of what's at stake. It's not just about someone reading your gossipy texts. It's about the potential disruption of critical infrastructure, compromised investigations, and even national security risks. This is way bigger than most people realize.
And that's what makes this so unsettling, right? We think of texting as this mundane, everyday thing, but it turns out it's a potential gateway for some pretty serious security breaches.
It's the classic case of something being so ubiquitous that we take it for granted, never stopping to think about the underlying systems and how vulnerable they might be.
Okay, so we've painted a pretty bleak picture here. But before we all throw our phones into the ocean, what can we as individuals do to protect ourselves?
Well, we already touched on the FBI's advice. Switching to encrypted messaging apps, enabling automatic updates, choosing devices with strong encryption, and using multi-factor authentication. Those are all good starting points. But honestly, it's like trying to put out a forest fire with a garden hose.
What do you mean?
Think about it. If the very foundation of our communication system is flawed, individual actions can only do so much. It's like everyone locking their doors while the entire neighborhood has no fence. We need a systemic solution.
So what's the answer?
We need to start demanding better from the tech companies and policymakers who shape our digital world. We need to push for a universal, secure standard for texting, regardless of the device you're using.
I completely agree, but how do we actually make that happen? It feels like such a massive undertaking.
It is. But it starts with awareness, like what we're doing right now. The more people understand the risks and the potential consequences, the more likely we are to see real change happen. And it's not just about complaining. It's about actively engaging with these companies, asking tough questions, and holding them accountable for creating safer, more secure systems.
So what would that look like in practice?
It could mean contacting your elected officials and urging them to support legislation that promotes stronger cybersecurity standards. It could mean choosing tech companies that prioritize security and privacy, and boycotting those that don't. It could even mean supporting organizations and initiatives that are working to develop open-source, secure communication protocols.
So it's about voting with our wallets, raising our voices, and supporting the right initiatives.
Exactly. Remember, this isn't about fear-mongering. It's about empowerment. The more informed we are, the more agency we have to shape the digital landscape and create a safer, more secure future for ourselves and for generations to come.
That's a great point. We often feel powerless when it comes to these tech giants, but we do have a say. We can demand better, and we should. So besides those individual actions and speaking up, is there anything else we can do to mitigate the risk while this larger shift is, hopefully, happening?
Absolutely. One crucial step is to be more mindful of the information you share via text. Ask yourself, do I really need to send this sensitive information this way? Are there alternative, more secure channels I could use?
So it's about being more discerning with what we share and how we share it.
Exactly. And it's also about educating others. Talk to your friends, family, and colleagues about this vulnerability. The more people who are aware of it, the better equipped we'll all be to make informed decisions.
It's like a digital neighborhood watch, right? We all need to look out for each other and spread the word.
Precisely. And that brings us to another important point, critical thinking. Don't believe everything you see or hear online. Be wary of phishing attempts, suspicious links, and requests for personal information. Develop a healthy skepticism and double-check things before clicking or sharing anything.
That's good advice for life in general, isn't it?
It is. And in the digital age, it's more important than ever. Remember, you are the first line of defense when it comes to protecting your information.
Okay, so we've talked about individual actions, systemic changes, and being more mindful about what we share. But let's zoom out even further. What are the long-term implications of this vulnerability? How might it impact our relationship with technology, our sense of privacy, and the way we interact with the world around us?
That's a question that keeps me up at night. As we become increasingly reliant on digital communication, and as these technologies become even more intertwined with our lives, the stakes only get higher. If we can't even trust something as basic as texting, what does that say about the future of privacy and security in a hyper-connected world?
It's a daunting thought.
It is. But I believe we're at a crossroads. We can either passively accept this erosion of privacy and security, or we can choose to fight for a different future. A future where our digital lives are protected, our data is secure, and our fundamental right to privacy is respected.
And that fight starts with each and every one of us.
Exactly. It starts with awareness, education, and a willingness to demand better from the companies and institutions that hold so much power over our digital lives.
So what does this all mean? What's the takeaway for our listeners?
The takeaway is this. We're all in this together. The digital world is not some separate realm. It's an extension of our physical lives, with real-world consequences. The choices we make, the actions we take, and the voices we raise have the power to shape this landscape. It's time to stop being passive consumers and start becoming active, informed citizens of the digital age.
Well said. And that brings us to the end of our deep dive for today.
But the conversation doesn't have to end here.
It's a lot to process, right? We started this deep dive thinking about texting, something most of us do without a second thought. And now we're talking about national security, digital citizenship, and the very future of privacy.
It's amazing how one seemingly small vulnerability can unravel so many threads, isn't it? But I think that's the point of these deep dives, you know? We take something familiar and really pull back the layers to see what's lurking beneath the surface.
Exactly, and sometimes what we find is a little unsettling. But like you said earlier, awareness is the first step towards change. Now that we know about this cross-platform texting vulnerability and the wider implications it represents, we can start making more informed choices.
Think of it this way. We've given you a flashlight to illuminate a dark corner. It might be a bit scary at first, but now you can see what's there and decide how you want to navigate it.
So let's bring it back to practical steps. For our listeners who are now understandably concerned, what are some concrete actions they can take right now to protect themselves?
Well, we've covered a lot of ground already. Switching to end-to-end encrypted messaging apps is a great first line of defense. Signal, WhatsApp, Telegram, these are all good options. And remember, it's not just about you. Encourage your friends and family to make the switch too. The more people who use encrypted messaging, the more secure our communication ecosystem becomes.
Right, it's like herd immunity for our digital lives.
Exactly. And don't underestimate the power of those seemingly small steps the FBI recommended.
Yeah.
Enabling automatic updates, choosing devices with strong encryption, and using multi-factor authentication for your accounts. These might seem like minor tweaks, but they can make a significant difference.
They're like the basic hygiene practices of the digital world, right? We wash our hands to prevent the spread of germs. We secure our devices to prevent the spread of malware and data breaches.
That's a great analogy. And just like good hygiene, these practices should become second nature. It shouldn't feel like a chore. It should be a part of your routine digital self-care.
Okay, so we've got our digital hygiene routine down. But beyond those individual actions, what can we do to push for that systemic change we talked about? How do we demand better security standards from the tech giants?
That's where your voice comes in. Contact your elected officials and let them know that cybersecurity is important to you. Support legislation that promotes stronger security standards and holds tech companies accountable.
So we're not just talking about tweeting our complaints, but actually engaging with the political process.
Exactly. Remember, those officials represent you. Make your voice heard. And don't forget the power of the purse. Support companies that prioritize security and privacy. Boycott those that don't. Vote with your wallet. It can make a difference.
It's about sending a clear message that we're not going to tolerate inadequate security practices.
Right. And there's another avenue you can explore. Supporting organizations and initiatives that are working to develop open-source, secure communication protocols. These are often nonprofit groups dedicated to creating more secure and privacy-respecting technologies. Your donations and support can go a long way.
So it's about putting our money where our mouth is and supporting the people who are actively building solutions. I love it.
And remember, it's not just about technology. It's about education and awareness. Talk to your friends and family about these vulnerabilities. Share what you've learned. The more informed people are, the more empowered we'll all be to demand better and make safer choices.
It's like we're all in this digital lifeboat together. We need to help each other stay afloat.
Exactly. We need to cultivate a culture of digital literacy and critical thinking. Don't believe everything you see online. Be skeptical, question sources, double-check information, and most importantly, be mindful of what you share. Think before you click, before you post, before you send that text.
That's such an important reminder. We're so quick to hit send, but we need to pause and consider the potential consequences.
Absolutely. In the digital age, every click, every share, every text is a decision. And those decisions have consequences. Let's make those decisions consciously and thoughtfully.
Well said. I think we've covered a lot of ground today. From the technical details of cross-platform texting vulnerabilities to the broader implications for our privacy and security in this increasingly digital world.
Yeah, we really went deep.
But the good news is we can take steps to protect ourselves, like using those encrypted messaging apps we talked about.
Absolutely. And we have the power to advocate for change and demand better security standards.
And that starts with each and every one of us. So, for our listeners, we'll leave you with this. What kind of digital future do you want to be a part of? Let us know your thoughts.
And in the meantime, stay vigilant and stay informed.
We'll see you next time for another deep dive.